The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction. This is the Worse Than Fiction podcast. My name is Les. Thank you for joining me. The feedback from episode 1 has been humbling and encouraging. I appreciate all the feedback even if you don't like the show, so by all means, send a message on Facebook through worsethanfictionpodcast.com or on Podbean. With time and experience and perhaps some help in the future, I aim to make this the best podcast I can, hopefully being as good as some of my personal favorites. I want to send a personal thank you out there to my cousin Adam, my wife Miranda, my mom, Renee and Scott, Martin and Evan from Ecdysis for providing the haunting theme music, and Carissa. You all contributed to the creation of this show in some way or another, and you have my gratitude. If you listened to episode 1, you may recall that I actually felt some sympathy for James Rupert, at least on some level. He was never loved from the day he was born. The subject of today's story, however, could never get an emotional response from me. This is the tale of a man who, growing up, was adored by his mother and siblings. He was a very smart, above-average student in school, often earning A grades, even considered gifted. After high school, he would go on to enroll at the Claremont Men's College in Claremont, California, with a goal of earning a bachelor's degree in economics. A few years later, in 1968, he would graduate, and shortly after, enlist in the U.S. Air Force, completing basic training and being stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in Kern County, California. He would be discharged a year later after confessing his homosexuality to officers and given a medical discharge. In 1970, less than a year later, he would take the first of many steps that would lead him on a path to being one of the most evil, terrifying serial killers the U.S. has ever seen. He committed acts against other people that would make horror movie villains jealous, and maybe even sick. I have to give an extra warning. If you have a weak stomach, you may want to skip this episode. I'll be detailing some of the worst and most heinous murders I've ever heard of, along with a harrowing story of rape from a survivor. This has been a nightmarish episode to put together, and you'll soon find out why. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of episode 2 of Worse Than Fiction. I hope you enjoy, if that's the right word for it. I'm a big fan of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. One particular song comes to mind when I think of the subject of this episode, and that would be The Kindness of Strangers. The song details a young girl who set out from her small town in Arkansas hitchhiking, with the goal of seeing the ocean. One person she would meet on her travels would ultimately be the boogeyman that her mother warned her about. Beware the stranger. Today's episode will reveal the story of a man who would pick his victims at random so long as they were male, but he had a preference for Marines. He would offer them a drink or a ride, or in many cases both. Dozens of these young men who accepted the company of this stranger would ultimately take their last breath in his presence. Some of you who've been into true crime for many years may already know who I'm talking about. He's not a household name like Ted Bundy or John Gacy, but his actions would disgust even the most hardened criminals and killers, I have no doubt, and his body count is almost certainly among the highest in U.S. history. I purposefully titled this episode to obscure the wretched monster I'll be talking about. The Southern California Strangler went by another name, which may be more familiar to some. He was best known as the Scorecard Killer. On March 19, 1945, one of the most evil humans to ever walk this planet arrives. Randolph Stephen Kraft is born to parents Harold Kraft and Opal Lee in Long Beach, California. Kraft, 39 years old, and Lee, 33 at the time, already had 3 girls when he was born. A few years earlier, Harold had set out to California from Wyoming and had eventually taken a job at Douglas Aircraft, where he worked on the production line and was said to have been a good employee. He also found a job for Opal before sending for her and the kids to join him. Opal and the girls had remained in Wyoming, with Opal maintaining a job as a waitress. Randy, unlike most of the vile monsters we'll talk about in later episodes of the podcast, would live a good life with his family. They lived by modest means and struggled a bit like many of us do, but they maintained steady income, with Opal also working to help pay the bills. Though Harold would be described as growing distant over the years, I've seen no reports indicating that he had abused his children or his wife in any way. He worked hard and took care of his family. Randy was loved not only by his parents, but his sisters were also known to be fond of the young boy. Sister Doris would say, "I used to rock him in my arms and sing him to sleep as a baby." They would be described as motherly toward young Randy Kraft. Randy Kraft's childhood story is an anomaly among those told by almost all serial killers. The overwhelming majority of those stories are filled with abuse, both mentally and physically, and often sexually as well. That isn't what we hear about Randy Kraft, though. There's something we will see with Randy, however, that a lot of murderers and particularly serial killers share besides abuse. That similarity is head trauma, and in a lot of serial killers, several instances of head injuries throughout life. We see the same thing with some athletes involved in contact sports such as American football, wrestling, or professional fighting. Head injuries rack up over the years, and sometimes that person will develop violent aggression, even though they may never have had a previous history of violence. Just after his first birthday, Randy fell off the family sofa and suffered a broken collarbone. I wasn't able to find out for certain if he hit his head in this instance, but it's certainly possible. When Randy was 2 years old, Harold had taken the family to look at a house that he had been considering buying. While on the concrete steps leading up to the porch, Randy would fall and hit his head, leaving him unconscious. He wouldn't regain consciousness for some time, at least until shortly after arriving at the local clinic. After waking up, he would be released with no further issues, at least not obvious ones. I can't say for certain that the head injury is related to the monster Randy would become, but it's worth at least mentioning, and we'll see more of it with other killers. At some point in 1948, when Randy was 3, the family would again relocate to Midway City, where they would take residence in a former Women's Army Corps dormitory, which Harold would rebuild into a 3-bedroom home. This is the place where Randy would spend much of his life, attending school, church, growing up with the rest of his peers. He was generally liked not only by his fellow classmates, but his teachers as well, with many of them recognizing his bright intellect, though not necessarily his athletic ability. Randy would be tested and score high enough to be enrolled in accelerated classes in 6th grade, while attending 17th Street Junior High School. In his teenage years, Randy would develop an interest in politics and align himself with the Republican Party. He had hoped to be elected to the U.S. Senate later in life, and in high school, he and a couple of his buddies even founded a political group for youth, the Westminster World Affairs Club. He would write essays in English class centered on politics, which he had won awards for. Much like the earlier years of his life in high school, he would be noticed by classmates and teachers alike as being a very smart young man, often earning A grades. He was a member of the school band with saxophone as his instrument of choice, and also enjoyed playing tennis. This was a young man who had a good prospective future ahead of him. It would be in high school, however, that suspicions of Randy being gay would arise among peers and school faculty. Randy had been known to date a few girls through high school, but according to him, it was just a ruse to conceal his attraction to boys. In 1963, Randy would go on to graduate 10th in his class of 390 students, a respectable achievement indeed, and earned a scholarship to Claremont Men's College. After high school, Randy would enroll in classes at Claremont Men's College, setting his sights on earning a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. He would be joined at the all-men's school by most of his friends, and they would continue doing what boys would do. Randy had kept his homosexuality a secret during these years. In those days, being openly gay would invite bullying and rejection. Randy had been a dedicated conservative Republican since his interest in politics had developed in his early teens, but it would be the assassination of President John F. Kennedy that would spark his eventual drift toward the Democratic side. Randy would go on later to state that he'd simply been mimicking his parents' ideals, and that he had actually been a liberal at heart for many years. During his freshman year, Randy had joined the school's ROTC program, which prepares youth for enlistment in the U.S. military. 2 years later, he would abandon the ROTC program and condemn the Vietnam War, which he had previously been in support of. Faculty and students at Claremont College were largely in favor of the war, but after a graduate was killed in action, Randy would be among the first students to openly stand against it. As a junior, Randy would go out cruising one night in the summer of 1966 and would have his first negative encounter with police when he attempted to solicit sex with what he had assumed to be a male sex worker in Huntington Beach. That sex worker was actually a vice cop working undercover in this infamous area that had been known for male prostitution. Since Randy didn't have a criminal record, however, police had simply issued him a warning and set him loose. In his senior year at Claremont, Randy was known to be a procrastinator, often putting off studying until the last minute. He would spend long hours in caffeine-fueled study sessions leading up to exams. It was because of these habits that he wouldn't graduate on time, instead having to repeat classes, but he would ultimately graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics in February of 1968. It would be during this time in his life that Randy would begin to open up and display his true feelings to his friends and family. He would register as a Democrat and take charge in grassroots politics, campaigning for Robert Kennedy. Kennedy had even written him a letter stating, "The campaign is a great challenge. It is my hope that you will choose to join with our Orange County committee in this effort. They have set a number of local events which I will attend. In addition, we have arranged for your participation, Mr. Kraft, in the gala scheduled for the Los Angeles Sports Arena. Looking forward to meeting you in Orange County. I am respectfully yours, Robert F. Kennedy." After graduating from the Claremont Men's College, Randy would enlist in the United States Air Force and be stationed at Edwards Air Force Base as an aircraft painter. During his time here, he would use his weekend leave to go to the beaches where he would cruise for a date. He was beginning to feel comfortable in his own skin at this point in his life, and he finally gathered the courage to come out as a gay man. Upon coming out, Randy would be discharged from the Air Force for medical reasons. Randy would then move back in with his parents. One of his close friends recalled that in letters he had written, Randy seemed suicidal. Randy would find employment as a bartender, and it wouldn't be long before this wolf in sheep's clothing would begin his reign of terror. Another close friend of Randy at the time would later recall a statement that Randy had made saying, "There's a part of me that you will never know." In March of 1970, Randy was cruising on the boardwalk in Huntington Beach when he met a 13-year-old boy who had run away from home. Randy offered him a place to stay along with free weed, drugs, and booze. Joseph Fancher would go with Randy to his apartment, where Randy turned on some music and lit a joint. The boy took a few puffs and began feeling tired and nauseous. He told Randy that he wasn't feeling well, and Randy got up and left the room. While he was gone, Joseph managed to use Randy's phone to call home and brag to his sister that he had ran away. Upon Randy's return, Joseph quickly hung up the phone, as Randy offered him 4 red pills, which he washed down with a big gulp of wine. A short time later, Joseph told Randy that he wasn't feeling any better, so Randy gave him 4 more pills. The effects came on quickly this time around, and Joseph would begin feeling drowsy. While he was fighting to stay awake, Randy showed him various pictures of men engaged in sex acts. One of the men in some of the photos was standing right in front of him. The boy got nervous and mumbled about turning on some more music so he managed to get up to his feet, and upon taking his first step, he fell face first onto the floor. After getting back onto the couch, Randy asked Joseph if he had ever had sex with a male, to which the boy wasn't able to respond. He was having trouble coordinating words at this point. Randy unzipped his pants and began to masturbate while ordering the boy to take his clothes off. Joseph was hardly able to move, so Randy walked over to the boy and forced his penis into his mouth and ejaculated. Randy would leave the room, and while gone, Joseph had managed to get onto the bed and lay down. When Randy returned, he sodomized the young boy and again left the room when he finished. Randy returned a short time later and raped him again, this time violently. Randy went back to the bathroom, and when he came out, he told Joseph that he was going to work, then he left the apartment. Eventually, Joseph was able to get to his feet and escape the apartment, seeking refuge in a bar across the street where emergency services were summoned. Joseph would lead police back to Randy's apartment, and upon searching, they found the boy's shoes, illegal narcotics, and dozens of photos of Randy having sex with other men. Since police didn't have a warrant for the search, no charges could be filed, and Randy would get away with the brutal rape of Joseph Fancher. There is no doubt in my mind that Joseph was on the verge of being Kraft's first murder victim that day. In 1971, Randy landed a job at a water bottling plant in Huntington Beach as a forklift operator. He scored 129 on an IQ test administered by his employee, which is close to genius level. During this time, he would enroll in classes at Long Beach State University with the goal of eventually becoming a teacher. It would be here that Kraft would meet a young man named Jeff Graves, and the two would ultimately have a relationship that would last several years. During this relationship, Kraft would begin his descent toward becoming one of the most brutal, inhumane, and devastating serial killers in U.S. history. There are far too many victims for me to detail in one episode, but we'll take a look at some of the first known or likely victims of the scorecard killer. October 5th, 1971, the decomposing body of an unknown male was found at the bottom of a ravine next to Ortega Highway in South Orange County. He was naked and had been exposed to the elements long enough that the coroner was unable to determine the exact cause of death. The time of death was estimated to have been on or around September 20th, 2 weeks prior to his discovery. He was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner couldn't find any signs of foul play. Toxicology testing determined that his blood alcohol level was 0.36% at the time of death, so the medical examiner listed the official cause as alcohol poisoning. Just down the highway from the bar where Randy had worked, 30-year-old Wayne Joseph Duquette's car would be found abandoned in the parking lot of the bar where he worked part-time as a bartender. No one had reported him missing, and after talking with friends and co-workers, police theorized that he had taken off on foot after having trouble with the vehicle, or he had hitched a ride with someone after having a few too many drinks. Police had no leads in this case, and no evidence pointing to murder, but what they did know was that people don't normally end up dead, naked, and laying at the bottom of a ravine unless they had some help getting there. It would be over a decade later that the case would finally get a break after investigators discovered Randy's scorecard, a sort of diary that Randy had maintained over the years. Most of the entries were a single word or two, and some were abbreviations. A couple of the entries would have the phrase 2 and 1 or the number 2, which investigators determined to be a code meaning 2 victims at the same time. The first entry, though, was simply the word stable. The name of the bar where Duquette had worked was the Stable. Randy was never charged in the death of Duquette due to a lack of evidence, but that first journal entry led to him being the only suspect in the case. December 26, 1972. The body of 20-year-old Edward Daniel Moore, a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton, was found along the 405 freeway in Seal Beach, California by a passing motorist at around 1:45 a.m. His body was later identified by fingerprints, and it was estimated that he had died 3 days prior to being found. What Randy Kraft did to this young man is shocking, to say the least, and even more shocking is that some of his other victims would suffer much more brutal tortures. His wrists and ankles had been bound, and he was severely beaten in the face with a blunt object believed to be a pipe. He had deep fingernail scratches on his testicles and bite marks on his penis, and had been strangled to death with a garrote. One of his own socks had been forced into his rectum, and he had been redressed after death and pushed out of a moving vehicle. Toxicology testing revealed only a trace amount of alcohol and no drugs in his system. On Randy's scorecard, the third entry was the letters EDM, which are Moore's initials, and what would be used by the prosecution to link him to the murder. Randy would escalate after this and begin terrorizing the region at a steady pace. Kraft's MO was fairly consistent and shockingly brutal, but it did vary in some cases. His actions rank among some of the worst I've ever heard of, so prepare yourself. I won't hold back any details. He preferred white men in uniform, specifically hunting Marines or patrons of the bars he would often visit. Most of his victims would be drugged with tranquilizers such as Valium or Ativan, then while in a vulnerable state, he would bind them and torture them to get what sick, sadistic pleasure he could. Many of his victims would be burned with the cigarette lighter from his car, almost always on their left nipple, others on their genitals, face, chest, belly, and in at least a couple cases, their eyes. He would sodomize them and force foreign objects, most often their own socks, into their rectum, which investigators thought to be a way for Randy to prevent their bowels from purging before he dumped the body. He would bite, pinch, scratch, cut, and in several cases, sever their genitals while they were still alive, some after death. A couple of his victims were left with tree branches or other wooden objects protruding from their anus. He would beat them with blunt objects, often in the face, and in the majority of cases, strangle them to death with a garrote, a belt, or possibly one of their own shoelaces. Other victims would be shot or stabbed, or would suffocate on objects he would shove down their throat. He would then reclothe them and push them out of his vehicle as he traveled along the various highways in the region. Also common among Kraft's victims was the fact that even though he had put clothes back on them, nearly all of them would be missing shoes or shoelaces, leading investigators to believe that he had used the laces to bind and/or strangle some of them. Often, his victims would be left with their pants unzipped, leaving their penis exposed. That is, if the penis was still intact. Though it has never been proven, Kraft was believed to have had an accomplice in some of his murders, due to footprint analysis around some of the crime scenes and the presence of at least 2 different semen types on some victims. Investigators also pointed to the fact that it would be very difficult to push a dead body out of a moving car while driving without help, while still maintaining control of the vehicle. Kraft was a sexual sadist, becoming aroused by the torture of his unfortunate victims. He didn't kill for greed or because some voice in his head was telling him to. He took pleasure in the control and fear in his victims' eyes. You could consider him both a disorganized and organized killer. He planned to kill, making sure he had drugs and alcohol to feed his victims in most cases, and would stalk the area around military bases looking for an unfortunate Marine. The disorganization is obvious when you consider that he made no attempt to hide his crimes or evidence, simply leaving the majority of his victims on the side of the road. What could lead a very intelligent man who wasn't abused as a child with no history of violent tendencies down this path? When you think about whether monsters are born or made, in the case of the Southern California Strangler, you'd have to come to the conclusion that he was born a monster. On February 6, 1973, a month and a half after the murder of Edward Moore, a nude male body would be discovered next to the Terminal Island Freeway in the Wilmington district of Los Angeles. This would be another of several of Kraft's victims who would remain unidentified to this day. Investigators simply called him John Doe 16 and estimated his age to be in the late teens or early 20s. The cause of death was listed as possible strangulation due to the ligature marks on his neck, and a sock had been forced into his rectum after death. Kraft wouldn't be charged with this murder, but it fits his typical MO and signature. I haven't heard of many, or for that case any, other killers who would stuff a victim's own sock into their anus until I heard of Randy Kraft. Sometime around 1 a.m. on April 14, 1973, a motorist spotted a body on the side of Ellis Avenue in Huntington Beach. There was no identification, and his fingerprints were never matched to any on file. Police would refer to him as John Doe Huntington Beach, and it wouldn't be until 1995 that he would be identified as Kevin Clark Bailey. Investigators estimated that he was between 18 and 25 years of age, and it was confirmed that he was indeed 18 when he was finally ID'd. He had ligature marks around both of his wrists, and markings around his mouth and nose suggested that he had been gagged, which they believed possibly resulted in his death by suffocation. Blood loss could also have been a factor. You see, before death, this unfortunate young man would sustain horrific torture at the hands of Randy Kraft. Rectal swabs revealed the presence of semen, confirming that he had been raped. He had lost around 2 pints of blood before death due to his penis and scrotum being severed from his body while he was still alive. There were numerous cuts made to different parts of his body post-mortem, and he had been redressed and pushed from a moving vehicle. The words Airplane Hill were scrawled into Randy's journal, which is what the area where his body was found had been called by locals, and this, along with Randy's modus operandi, would be used to link him to this brutal murder. Airplane Hill is the 5th entry on his scorecard, with the 2nd entry Angel, and 4th Harikari, unable to be linked to any known victims. The body of Vincent Cruz Mestas would be found at the bottom of a ravine in the San Bernardino Mountains on December 29, 1973. His head and face had been freshly shaven, and his hands were severed and covered with bags. An unspecified wooden object had been forced into his urethra, and his genitals were mutilated. He was strangled to death, and one of his own socks had been stuffed into his rectum. On Randy's scorecard, the 10th entry would be Vincent M. The investigators believed that this, the circumstances of his murder, and the fact that Randy lived only a few blocks away from Vincent was a direct link, but they would not prosecute him for this crime. June 2, 1974, a body was discovered along Highway 86 near Salton Sea. He was identified as Malcolm Eugene Little, a 20-year-old man from Selma, Alabama. Malcolm's brother was a long-haul truck driver, and Malcolm had ridden along with him to California, where he would be dropped off at the Garden Grove Freeway and San Diego Freeway interchange. I'm unsure of why he wanted to be left there, but this would be a decision that I'm sure the rest of his family would rather he didn't make. Little's body would be found posed with a tree branch forced into his rectum. His penis and scrotum were cut from his body, and he had been strangled to death. The entry linked to this murder was number 22, and it simply stated teen trucker, and due to a lack of evidence, Kraft would also not be prosecuted for this murder. Entries 6 through 8 are a mystery, but entry 9, Twiggy, was believed by investigators to refer to the murder of James Dale Reeves, a 19-year-old male from Cyprus. He would be linked to Randy Kraft by only a small amount of circumstantial evidence, and Kraft would not be prosecuted for this murder. The body of James Dale Reeves was found along the San Diego Freeway in Irvine on Wednesday, November 27, 1974, the day before Thanksgiving that year. His cause of death was undetermined, but he had been posed with his legs stretched out in a Y position, and a 3-inch diameter tree branch had been forced into his rectum. It's theorized that the entry Twiggy is Kraft's deranged reference to his final touch to this murder, the tree branch. Reeves was seen at the Ripples Bar on the day of his murder, a regular cruising spot where Randy was known to hang out at times. I find it curious that the entries on the scorecard don't seem to be in a specific order, certainly not written chronologically. Perhaps Randy wrote them well after the murders had taken place. This murder, which I noted related to the 9th entry, occurred 11 months after the murder linked to the 10th entry. Confused yet? This is why I theorize that Randy must have written this list late in his serial killing career, and we'll see more out of order entries as we go down the list. There were many murders that occurred leading up to the end of 1974 with similar circumstances, so many that finally, on June 24, 1975, representatives from various police jurisdictions in the region would meet and organize a task force to stop the Southern California Strangler once and for all. Officials from Orange, Imperial, and San Bernardino counties, accompanied by municipal officials from local cities such as Los Angeles, Long Beach, Seal Beach, Irvine, and Huntington Beach would join the hunt. An FBI profiler, along with a number of forensic psychologists, would be brought into the investigation of the murders that had terrorized the area. The profiler gave the theory that the killer was a man that desires to be masculine but does not feel masculine, gnawing the nipples and genitals of his prey to symbolically make the victim a female. Though every effort was made to catch this monstrous killer, unfortunately, it would be nearly another decade before Kraft would be discovered. Parking lot. Those are the words scrawled into the 19th place on the scorecard. On May 8th, 1975, a human skull was found close to the 72nd Street jetty in Long Beach, about 1,000 feet from a parking lot. Dental records were used to identify the skull as belonging to 19-year-old Keith Davin Crotwell. Keith, along with friend Kent May, had went to Big John's Fun Hall on the evening of March 29th. They had been drinking and went for a walk while having a conversation about an argument that Kent had with a girl just before. It was during this conversation that they would be approached by a man who seemed friendly. May had asked the man if he was gay, as the area had been a popular cruising spot. The stranger said that he wasn't and was just out for a casual walk. He offered the two some drugs and they agreed, so the three went to the stranger's Ford Mustang, where he would retrieve the pills and give them to the boys. They each took at least half a dozen of the pills that were marked with the number 10 on one side and washed them down with beer. Not long after, the three got in the Mustang and drove away. This would be the last that Kent would remember of that night, waking up at his home the next day with a hangover and little memory of the night before. Two friends of the boys, who had also been at Big John's Fun Hall that night and in the early hours of the 30th, would return looking for Keith and Kent. What they saw was a Ford Mustang in the parking lot with the passenger door open, and would witness a man push Kent out of the back seat. Kent would stumble around a bit and fall to the ground, and the stranger pulled him away from the car a short distance, then got back in the car and sped away in the direction of Seal Beach. Michael Dittmar and Randy Cooper, the two friends, went searching for the distinctive Mustang and eventually found it in Long Beach. They got the plate number, then notified the authorities that in this car was the last time anyone had seen Keith. Detective Michael Woodward of the Long Beach Police Department would track down none other than Randy Kraft, to whom the car was registered, and request an interview at police headquarters. On May 19th, Detective Robert Bell would interview Kraft on tape about his involvement. Randy had confirmed that he had picked someone up in the area of Big John's within the previous couple of months, describing it as drinking beer with two males, then driving around for less than half an hour before returning to the parking lot. He told the detective that one of the males got out of the car while the other one wanted to stay, so he took off and headed to the San Diego freeway, where he would allow the passenger to drive. The young man, Kraft said, got the car stuck on an embankment, so he got out and walked to a couple of gas stations nearby, which had been closed. He would then use a phone at a nearby restaurant to call his other half to come and help, but since Jeff Graves had a Volkswagen, he decided it would probably be of no use. Randy would ask a couple that were in the restaurant who had a pickup truck if they could help get his car back onto the road, to which they agreed. Upon arriving back to his car, Kraft told Detective Bell that the young man that had been with him was gone, so he looked around the area briefly, then went to meet Graves back at the restaurant. Kraft asserted to Detective Bell that he wasn't connected to the disappearance of Keith Crotwell in any way. Several months later, on October 19th, a group of kids came across a rolled-up rug inside a large drainage pipe in the city of Laguna Hills. Inside the rug were the skeletal remains of a human body, except for the skull. The remains would be identified as the rest of Keith Crotwell's body. There are many more victims that Kraft killed, or is strongly believed to have killed, in the early 70s, and my condolences go out to all of the families of those innocent men, and to all of their loved ones who found their lives shattered by this putrid pile of shit. Many of them have never been identified or even found. I can't even pretend to imagine the hurt that Kraft caused, He would be prosecuted for some of his early victims, but for many others, he would not. Kraft moved at a steady pace from 1971 through 1975, especially when you consider the scorecard would have been almost half complete by this time. But it would be after his questioning and the disappearance of Keith Crotwell that Randy was believed to have been spooked, so the killings would stop. For a short while, at least. Of course, as many of us know, serial killers usually don't just stop killing. As John Douglas would say, they only stop if they're caught, incarcerated, or dead, at least in the vast majority of cases. It would be around the end of 1975 that Randy's relationship with Jeff Graves would disintegrate. Later on, investigators would theorize that Randy's murders were influenced by the relationship. They believed that when the two were on good terms, his murders would be much less brutal than if the couple were fighting. After their breakup, Kraft would commit his most heinous murder up to that point, and they were certainly all heinous, but this one was particularly terrifying. New Year's Eve, 1975. Entry 36 on the scorecard just so happens to read New Year's Eve. Mark Hall and his friend Philip Holmer went out to celebrate the new year, and after having a few drinks at a bar, they left and went to a party where they would smoke a bit of weed and drink to the point of intoxication. After some time, they would leave and show up at a party a few blocks from Interstate 5 and San Juan Capistrano, where Hall would eventually lay down on a sofa due to his drunkenness making him sleepy. Philip was having a good time hanging out with the other partiers and later noticed that Hall wasn't there anymore. 3 days later, an off-duty police officer who was out with friends in dune buggies, off-roading in the Saddleback Mountain area, discovered Hall's body tied to a tree near a road. He was naked, and his penis and scrotum had been severed. He had burns consistent with a vehicle cigarette lighter on his nose, lips, left nipple, eyes, and eyelids. Dirt was found densely packed into his throat, and it is believed that he was alive when this occurred. The medical examiner reported that it was unlikely that dirt could have been forced that deeply into his trachea, and is evidence that he had choked and gagged in the process. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of suffocation and alcohol poisoning. The toxicology report listed his blood alcohol level at 0.67%, which is around 50 to 100% higher than the amount that would kill most people. A swizzle stick, which is used to stir drinks, had been jammed into his urethra so deeply that it penetrated his bladder. His severed penis and one of his testicles was forced into his rectum, but the other testicle was never found. There was also a 12-inch gash on his leg that apparently occurred after death. Randy Kraft's right thumbprint was found on several pieces of broken glass, discovered to be fragments of a broken bottle nearby, and he would ultimately be prosecuted for this terrible murder. Mark Hall undoubtedly suffered what we could all consider one of the most horrific deaths a person could imagine. I think you're probably getting the point of just how evil this man is by now. Reading the court documents and various articles related to Randy Kraft's crimes has been a harrowing experience, and I was already aware of Kraft before. I knew only the basics of his case, and after going much deeper, I realized that he is indeed one of the real-life boogeymen. He's the man your mother warns you about when she says, "Don't talk to strangers." If I were to detail all of the murders he committed, this would be a 4-part series, but I don't think any of us want to hear the phrases "severed genitals" or "into his rectum" over and over for 3 or 4 hours. Randy would continue his murderous rampage throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. He continued raping, emasculating, and strangling often several victims in the span of a month. Like nearly every other serial killer in history, Kraft would keep a trophy from most kills to remind him of what he most likely considered as being a good time. A piece of luggage, a shaving kit, a picture of the victim tied up naked, an instruction manual to a victim's harmonica. There would be many items that police would find linking him to dozens of the victims coded onto his scorecard. Heading into the 1980s, Kraft would eventually travel and, not surprisingly, kill in other states. In 1980, he would find himself in Portland, Oregon, on assignment from his job as a computer programmer, where he would kill a 17-year-old male by the name of Michael O'Fallon. He wouldn't be prosecuted for this murder, but evidence collected later, the method of murder, and the scorecard entry, Portland, Denver, would link Kraft to this murder. O'Fallon was raped and strangled to death. Toxicological analysis revealed that he had Valium and alcohol in his system. He was found with his wrists bound to his ankles, 10 miles from Salem, Oregon. It is believed that Kraft killed at least 6 young men during his time in Oregon based on the scorecard entries and the modus operandi. Kraft was also known to have traveled to Grand Rapids, Michigan on a business trip in December of 1982. On the 9th of that month, 2 bodies would be found in a field a few miles away from the hotel they were staying in while attending a convention. Dennis Patrick Alt and Christopher Schoenborn, cousins, had been seen talking to Kraft in the bar of the hotel on the night before their murders. After checking out of the hotel, Alt's keys would be found by housekeepers in Kraft's room. After his eventual arrest, investigators found a jacket belonging to Schoenborn in Kraft's apartment. Portland Blood is the 50th entry on the scorecard and was believed by investigators to refer to Michael Cluck, an 18-year-old man whose body was found just off Interstate 5 in Goshen, Oregon on April 10, 1981. The official cause of death would be ruled as blunt force trauma. He was raped and, according to the medical examiner, struck at least 31 times in the back of the head with a heavy object. This is believed to be the bloodiest crime scene that Kraft was responsible for. This murder was not mentioned in court documents, but the entry in the scorecard, along with a shaving kit that belonged to Cluck, was found in Kraft's possession and is strong evidence that he was responsible. Friday, February 11th, 1983, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 12 midnight, witness Bryce Wilson later reported hanging out with Roger Duvall Jr. and Jeffrey Allen Nelson outside his house in Cypress. He didn't believe that they were under the influence of any drugs or alcohol at the time. A while later, somewhere around 1:30 a.m., Nelson came to the door of the residence, knocked, and when Sharon, Bryce's mother, answered the door, he asked if he could speak with Bryce. He was sleeping at the time, and Mrs. Wilson stated that she was unable to wake him, so Jeffrey left the residence. At around 5:15 later that morning, Donald Batchelder, an LAPD officer on his way to work, reported the discovery of Jeffrey's body near the on-ramp of Euclid Street and Garden Grove Freeway in Garden Grove, California. According to Officer Batchelder, Nelson may have still been alive at this point, reporting that he had seen one of his feet move. The officer quickly got back into his car and headed to the nearest phone that he could find, where he would call police to the scene. When police arrived, they found the body of Nelson, which was still warm, indicating that he hadn't been dead for long. Abrasions all over his body indicated that he had been thrown from a moving vehicle, and he had ligature marks on his neck. His genitals were severed from his body perimortem, which would be near the time of death. A combination of alcohol and Valium were found in his system, which likely would have sedated him completely. 2 days later, a motorist discovered the body of Roger Duvall Jr. on a hillside near Mount Baldy Road. His pants were unbuttoned and pulled below his waist. He had ligature marks on his neck and left wrist and died as a result of asphyxia due to neck compression. Investigators found white sand caked onto the blood around his lips and nose. Valium and propranolol were found in his system, and his blood alcohol level was 0.07%, just under the legal limit to drive. The entry on the scorecard linked to this double murder was 2-in-1 Beach. Police would later find a photo of Duvall in Randy's apartment in which he appeared to be dead. A few months after the double murder would finally come the fall of Randy Kraft and the end of his brutal reign. On May 14, 1983, California Highway Patrol officers Michael Howard and Michael Sterling were patrolling Interstate 5 near San Juan Capistrano when they spotted a car weaving across its lane. They would conduct a traffic stop, suspecting the driver to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and the man sitting in the driver's seat was Randy Kraft. They had him exit the vehicle to begin field sobriety testing and noticed that his pants were undone. After testing, they concluded that he was intoxicated and arrested him. In the passenger seat there was a man who appeared to be passed out, and Randy told the officers he was a hitchhiker. Officer Howard tried to wake the man, but he didn't respond, so Howard went to the driver's side and entered the car and checked his pulse. There wasn't one, and he wasn't breathing. A jacket was spread across his lap, and when Howard removed it, he discovered the man's pants were pulled down, exposing his genitals, and the clothing in the area was wet. Marks on his wrist were described as consistent with the markings that a wide rubber band would make. A pill bottle was found in the floorboard of the car that was labeled Ativan and prescribed to Kraft. Randy admitted to a paramedic that arrived he had given Terry Lee Gambrell, a 25-year-old Marine, some of his prescribed Ativan. The medical examiner would conclude the cause of death to be ligature strangulation, with evidence that the ligature had been repeatedly loosened and tightened. Randy Kraft had been caught in the act of what would thankfully be his last murder. Certainly an extremely rare outcome when it comes to serial killers. Upon searching his vehicle, police would find dozens of photographs depicting young men in sexual poses, many of whom appeared to be either sleeping or dead. Upon searching the trunk of the vehicle, detectives would find a 3-ring binder, and in that binder, they would find a list written by Randy Kraft. In total, there were 61 entries on Randy's scorecard, most of which wouldn't be prosecuted due to a lack of solid, court-admissible evidence, or no body had been found that corresponded. That's not to say there was no evidence. Many of the victims on his list would not only be linked by the scorecard itself, but by the MO, pictures of the victims found in Randy Kraft's car, home, and personal items that belonged to them in Kraft's possession, and being frequent visitors to Kraft's usual haunts. In total, investigators of the case of Randy Kraft strongly believe he is responsible for no less than 61 murders, and more likely than not, a total of 67 or more. Randy's lips have been sealed all these years, and we will likely never know for sure what the true number is. Prosecutors had gathered enough evidence, they believed, to secure convictions for a total of 16 murders, and preliminary hearings began on September 27, 1983, and would continue for 7 weeks. Finally, over 5 years after the first hearing, the trial would begin, and lasted 13 months, becoming the most expensive trial in Orange County history. Mountains of evidence was presented by the prosecution, and the defense would attempt to dismiss almost all of it as circumstantial or coincidental at best, even attempting to blame other serial killers for Randy's crimes. Kraft had photos and negatives of many of his suspected victims in his home, and personal effects that belonged to some. After all the testimony of witnesses and evidence was shown, the jury deliberated for 11 days before returning with a guilty verdict for all 16 murder charges. They recommended the death penalty, and so it would be that Judge Donald McMartin would hand down exactly that sentence on November 29, 1989. McMartin would say, "I think I've sent 8 or 9 individuals to their death in my courtroom before. I can take all those aggravating circumstances in those other cases, and they don't match Mr. Kraft's record. I just can't comment. If anyone ever deserved the death penalty, he's got it coming." Kraft was ordered to serve out his sentence at San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row to this day. He still maintains his innocence, despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. Alright, that's gonna do it for episode 2. If you managed to get through all of that, kudos to you. It was a rough case. I outlined only a small portion of the Randy Kraft saga in this podcast, and if you really want to dive deep, the book Angel of Darkness by Dennis McDougall is a very thorough dive into this story, and would definitely be my first recommendation. If you liked the episode, head over to Facebook and leave a thumbs up there, or leave a rating on your podcast app. I'm looking for some case suggestions, so if you have one that you think is interesting, send me an email at worsethanfictionpodcast.gmail.com, or you can head to the website and contact me there. Thanks for listening, and remember, beware the stranger.